Today I want to talk to you about a film that many people consider the original, the first horror film, and that is The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1920. This film is a silent film. It's of course black and white. And it's actually a German expressionist film. So the reason why I have this on my 100 horror film countdown, my 100 years of horror, is you can't talk about the present without talking first about the past and where exactly we came from. And this is pretty much where it all starts. This film has a lot of really interesting plot points, a lot of really interesting plot devices that we would see in a lot of later horror films. So the film is actually told through the perspective of the main character, Francis, and his flashbacks. So he is telling of an ordeal that has happened to him. First off, I just wanted to point out that I thought that was actually a really interesting plot device that I don't think is pushed enough, is the fact that you have a 1920s film that actually is told entirely through a flashback sequence. I wasn't initially expecting that from a film of this era. Most films at the time were very realist in what they were showing, and in their production they were much more of a realistic tone and style. So the idea that you have someone who is explaining the entire story through flashbacks, I thought was really just an interesting plot point. And again, it's a device that we would see, appear in several other films from this point forward, not just horror, but just as an overall interesting device. So it's Francis's flashbacks of a time when him and his friend Alan were at a carnival and met Dr. Caligari, who is a gentleman who reigns a somnambulist or a sleepwalker named Caesar. And so Caesar is in a permanent state of sleep, according to the film. He's been asleep for, I believe it's 25 years or 23 years, but he is only awoken by Dr. Caligari so that way he can answer questions about the future. And so, again, this is another really just key plot point that we'll see in lots of other films, where you have someone, especially when you look in a lot of the early zombie films, the pre-Romero, pre-Night of the Living Dead zombie films, you find a lot of someone being under someone else's control as a huge plot device in a lot of horror films. And I think that in later years, especially like in the 80s and 90s, and even like early 2000s somewhat, you see a fear of, as opposed to the fear being the person that is in control of someone else and what that person will do, it becomes the fear of losing control of yourself. So, I mean, I thought, again, this was a really interesting plot device, especially for the time, when you have such realistic interpretations, or movies that are being set in a real setting. This, however, is set far from it. This is a German expressionist film, so it's got very interesting imagery, to say the least. And so this film really is a fantasy film, and when you look at the backgrounds and the scenery, it's very angular with a lot of swirled, kind of spiral staircases, and the closest thing that we kind of have now to such really interesting, out of proportioned, really iconic kind of scenery is someone like Tim Burton, who has the very angular, disproportionate kind of films and the kind of imagery. And an interesting note for the reason of that is that apparently the area where these sets were actually set up was only roughly 6 meters. So they really had a small area to work with, which creates a lot of really small, tight shots, a lot of not quite a claustrophobic feeling, but definitely a very restricted feeling. And because of the really interesting backgrounds, you get pulled into a lot of what is going on in the forefront, but also creates for a very uneasy feeling because there isn't a comfortable point of rest for your eyes when you're looking at a lot of the backgrounds. Another thing was that while they were in production, this is post-World War I Germany, so my understanding is that the electricity at the time was actually being rationed, which meant that in order for them to film, a lot of times they were not able to use the type of lighting that you might use in other settings. So what they did instead was they actually painted light beams into a lot of the backgrounds, which again adds to a really unreal kind of feel because there isn't that natural lighting hitting it. So again, just the imagery itself, and especially with this being such an early film, with this being a 1920s film, a lot of the makeup and a lot of the characters are still coming from that time of stage productions. And so you've got the kind of deep inset, you know, makeups where you've got heavy lines, you know, around the cheeks, around the eyes, and those really bold features, which in stage is necessary because the audience is so far away, but with this being a film, and again, because it is such an early film, this is something that you'll see in a lot of earlier films. But because it's the film and because of the unusual backgrounds, it really sets in for a very creepy tone when people have such bold features. I know definitely, even though I know you're supposed to be a little bit more afraid of Caesar, I was actually a little bit unnerved by the appearance of Dr. Caligari, just his first few appearances where you actually see his face on screen, because he has these very bold features. So, I mean, I thought that was just, it really creates the feel and the emotion for this film. Another kind of interesting point to note also is that this film, the original script, had things like light bulbs and telegraphs and a telephone in it, but all of those were actually cut, and my guess is it could possibly have something to do with the electricity being rationed. But so what you end up getting is that you have a film that doesn't have any of our traditional markers. You know, we look back at the 80s and we see people pull out giant cell phones, and those, you know, immediately we know, well, that's the 80s because our cell phone's like this big, and you know, you don't have any of that. The only thing you have is you have a scene where somebody lights a candle outside, and so it creates this, again, with it creating its own fantasy world as opposed to just being a representation of the time, which was still, you know, fairly unusual. So, I mean, I thought that overall this is a movie that, I mean, I understand, you know, I have to say, I'm somebody who, you know, 90s kid, grew up watching a lot of 80s films, a lot of 90s films, early 2000. So silent films at first are not something that I generally would run to as, oh, I wanna watch that. Like, I'll watch a 50s movie all day, but a 20s film is a little bit more of a kind of point where I take a step back and I'm like, I don't know. But I have to say that this film, not just because of its pivotal history, but also just because of how really creepy this is. And you start to see a lot of the other influence that this film had once you've seen it. If you've ever watched, for example, like Queen of the Damned, which is one of my favorite films, and it might make it on this list, it might not, but you know, if you've ever watched a movie like that, part of the music videos that are created for Lestat in that movie are based on this film. I mean, the imagery is so uneasy, and it makes you feel so just not secure within the story. It's really definitely worth a watch. It's, you know, I think it's only like a little over an hour, like an hour and 20 minutes. So it's a fairly short film, but it's definitely worth it, at least to sit through once and say you did it and see what all the fuss is about, because again, I mean, this is where horror really started. This is considered, for pretty much everybody, this is the start of it all. So if you haven't seen it yet, you should definitely go out and watch it. So thanks for sitting with me, and I'll see you again tomorrow.